and adulation he deserves.
It's like unconquered territory.
There are moments in music history that only reveal their true weight long after they have passed. August 9th, 1986, was one of those moments. On that warm English summer evening at Knebworth Park in Hertfordshire, Freddie Mercury walked onto a stage for the very last time as the frontman of Queen. He wore his iconic yellow military jacket. He arrived by helicopter. He sang his heart out for 120,000 people who were screaming his name. And not a single soul in that enormous field, not the fans, not his bandmates, not even the crew who had traveled with him across Europe for months, understood what they were witnessing. They were watching a goodbye that no one had been told was a goodbye. That is perhaps the strangest and most heartbreaking fact at the center of Queen's final concert with Freddie Mercury. It was not announced as a farewell. It was not framed as the end of an era. It was billed simply as the closing night of the Magic Tour, one last massive celebration to cap off one of the most successful European tours the band had ever mounted. 26 shows across 9 countries, in front of more than 400,000 people total, had built toward this climax at Knebworth. By any measure, Queen was at the peak of its powers, and Freddie Mercury, despite everything happening beneath the surface, was determined to perform like it. What made the night so strange, so saturated with meaning that only hindsight could fully illuminate, was the combination of forces swirling around it. Mercury was carrying a secret that would not become public knowledge for another 5 years. His body was beginning to show the early strains of a disease he had not yet been formally diagnosed with, though he almost certainly sensed what was wrong. His bandmates were noticing behavioral shifts they could not quite explain. A fan in the crowd would not survive the night, and the entire concert, this landmark, monumental, irreplaceable performance, would go almost entirely unrecorded, leaving history with little more than fragments and memories of what happened. This is the story of what really went on during Freddie Mercury's final concert, and the deeper you look, the stranger and more profound it becomes. Before a single note was played at Knebworth, the show carried an unusual energy that insiders sensed but could not name. The Magic Tour had been an extraordinary success. After Queen's legendary performance at Live Aid in July 1985, which is widely regarded as one of the greatest live sets in rock history, the band had returned to touring with their 12th studio album, A Kind of Magic. The demand was overwhelming. When promoter Harvey Goldsmith put Wembley Stadium on sale, the venue sold out almost immediately. A second night was added. Dates in Newcastle and Manchester followed. And when all of that still wasn't enough to satisfy the appetite, Goldsmith added one final colossal show at Knebworth Park, a historic estate in Hertfordshire that had hosted legendary concerts before. It sold out rapidly as well. Queen arrived at Knebworth in spectacular fashion. Rather than pulling up in a tour bus like ordinary mortals, the band flew in by helicopter, sweeping dramatically over the Thames and landing just backstage. It was pure theater, exactly the kind of grand entrance that defined everything about who Queen was. But backstage, before the helicopter's blades had even stopped turning, something was quietly off. Here is one of the strangest and most overlooked facts about that night. Despite this being the closing show of a massive, professionally organized European tour, despite the fact that the Wembley shows just weeks earlier had been professionally filmed and would later be released as the celebrated live concert video, nobody filmed Knebworth properly. No official cameras were rolling. No professional crew was positioned to capture what turned out to be Freddie Mercury's final performance with a band. As Henry Lytton-Cobbold, whose family owns Knebworth House, and who watched the concert as a young man in his 20s, later remarked with undisguised astonishment, the fact that no one pressed record on the great showman's final night remains almost incomprehensible. The only existing footage of the performance is a Dutch bootleg, an audience member's shaky recording of a video screen at the back of the crowd. For a concert of this magnitude, with an artist of this stature, that absence of documentation is extraordinary. It means the world lost its clearest window into that evening the moment it ended. The stage setup itself was a monument to ambition. According to documented accounts of the Magic Tour's production, the Knebworth setup featured 5,000 amplifiers and more than 8.5 miles of cable to power everything. The video screen alone was 20 feet by 30 feet, requiring its own dedicated generator. The sound system was so powerful that residents in villages surrounding Nebworth reportedly complained about the noise. This was a production built for the gods of rock and roll, and Freddie Mercury was its centerpiece. The summer of 1986 was filled with small, strange moments, comments Mercury made, behaviors that seemed slightly out of character, that only made sense years later. They were clues scattered across the months leading up to Nebworth, clues that suggested Mercury knew, on some level, that his time performing live was running out. 2 weeks before the Nebworth show, Queen played a historic concert in Budapest, Hungary, becoming one of the first major Western rock acts to perform behind the Iron Curtain. At some point during that trip, a reporter asked Mercury whether he planned to return to Budapest to play again in the future. Mercury's answer was not the kind of cheerful, promotional response a healthy rock star in his prime typically gives. He simply replied, "If I'm still alive." The journalist reportedly did not know what to make of the comment. Mercury moved on, but the words lingered. There was also a moment during an argument among the band members, the kind of petty but passionate disagreement that any group of creative people who have spent years together will have, in which Mercury made another remark that his bandmates would not fully understand until much later. As Brian May later recalled, Mercury concluded the dispute by saying, "Well, I won't always be here to do this." At the time, May and the others took it as Freddie being dramatic, perhaps simply expressing frustration at the exhaustion of touring. But with the knowledge of what came after, the words carry an entirely different gravity. Mercury was formally diagnosed as HIV positive in April 1987, nearly a year after Nebworth. But those close to him have suggested that he was already experiencing symptoms and carrying a suspicion, if not a near certainty, about his condition during the Magic Tour. His personal assistant Peter Freestone, who was with him constantly throughout that period, later said that Mercury had watched many friends die of AIDS during the early 1980s and that it was always on his mind. The fear was present, the awareness was present, and yet Mercury chose to perform anyway, night after night, giving audiences everything he had. On the night of the Nebworth concert itself, Mercury arrived backstage and spent his final pre-show minutes in the dressing room doing something remarkable. Existing footage from backstage captures him asking someone off camera how long until showtime. When he hears the answer, 10 minutes, he immediately launches into a full a cappella warm-up, singing scales and exercises with startling power and range, showing off his voice with what appears to be pure joy. Roger Taylor walks in and joins him for an impromptu duet. There's laughter, there is electricity, and then, 10 minutes later, Freddie Mercury walked out onto that enormous stage for the last time. The setlist at Nebworth was a sweeping, generous journey through Queen's entire catalog. The band opened with One Vision and worked through 26 songs over the course of the evening, including Tie Your Mother Down, 7 Seas of Rye, A Kind of Magic, Under Pressure. Another one bites the dust. Who Wants to Live Forever? I Want to Break Free. Bohemian Rhapsody. Hammer to Fall. Crazy Little Thing Called Love. Radio GAGA. We Will Rock You. Friends Will Be Friends. And We Are the Champions. Closing the entire night with a recorded version of God Save the Queen, played over the PA while the band took their final bows. For much of the show, Mercury was every bit the commanding presence the crowd had paid to see. He played the audience like a second instrument, conducting them through massive call and response sections, leading sing-alongs, throwing his voice out across a field of 120,000 people with precision and authority. During an improvised vocal section, a part of the show that had become one of the defining Queen live rituals, Mercury demonstrated his extraordinary range in real time, bending and shaping his voice in ways that stunned even seasoned observers. There were moments, though, where something else flickered through. Observers watching bootleg footage closely have noted occasional moments where Mercury seemed to be working harder than usual, pushing his voice to reach places it had once visited effortlessly. He covered these moments with showmanship, with humor, with that particular gift he had for making even imperfection seem like part of the performance. But they were there. The body that had carried him through 2 decades of extraordinary physical performance was beginning to make itself known. At one point during Love of My Life, the tender piano ballad that Mercury often let the audience sing back to him, The crowd took over the melody so completely and with such warmth that the moment became genuinely overwhelming. It was one of those concert experiences that transcends the transactional relationship between performer and audience, becoming something more like a collective communion. Standing at the microphone while 120,000 voices sang his own song back to him, Mercury appeared visibly moved. While Mercury's final farewell is the story most people focus on, there was another remarkable and largely underreported moment happening simultaneously that night, and it centered on John Deacon, Queen's quiet, self-contained bassist. Of the four members of Queen, Deacon was always the most private, the most outwardly calm, the one who kept his emotional temperature the most closely regulated. He was the band's financial mind, the member who had once been a qualified electronics engineer, the one who sat down during interviews while the others held court. He rarely made a scene. He was, by all accounts, the most settled and grounded of the four, which is precisely what made what happened at Nebworth so extraordinary. According to roadie Peter Hintz, who worked closely with the band throughout the Magic Tour, Deacon smashed his bass guitar into his amplifier at some point during the performance. A burst of raw, uncharacteristic aggression from someone who simply did not behave that way. Hintz later recalled that Deacon wasn't angry at his equipment, and he wasn't directing his frustration at anyone in particular. The cause was unclear. John acted strangely on that tour, Hintz noted. He was doing stuff that was out of character. What seems likely, looking back, is that Deacon sensed something that night that went beyond the normal emotional weight of a tour's closing show. He and Mercury had been friends and collaborators for 15 years. Deacon was perceptive. He would have noticed things. The way Mercury moved, the way he talked about the future, the effort behind performances that had once seemed effortless. Brian May later recalled that Mercury had made that striking remark about not always being there to do this. These were the kinds of things that a sensitive, observant person would absorb and carry through the night. Whatever its source, Deacon's behavior at Nebworth was a crack in the composed surface he always presented to the world. He walked out onto that stage and delivered, by most accounts, one of the finest performances of his life, as though the emotional pressure had been channeled into something extraordinary. But backstage, something in him had already broken. Years later, Deacon would retire from music entirely, refusing all interviews and public appearances. The night at Nebworth, it seems, marked a kind of ending for him too. The concert was not without darkness in the most literal sense. Backstage after the show, the band received word of a tragedy that had unfolded in the crowd during the performance itself. A 21-year-old fan had been fatally stabbed in the chaos of the enormous crowd, with medics unable to reach him in time through the press of 120,000 people. The news arrived as the band was coming down from the adrenaline of the performance, and it cast a shadow over everything. The triumph of what had just happened on stage was immediately complicated by the knowledge that someone had lost their life in the field. The sheer scale of the Nebworth crowd made it one of the largest single-paying audiences for a concert in UK history at that point in time. Some estimates put the total at closer to 200,000 when accounting for all those on the grounds. Managing the safety of a crowd that size was, by any standard, an enormous challenge, and the tragedy that night underscored how the mechanics of mass gatherings could turn lethal in ways that were difficult to prevent or respond to quickly enough. For the band, the news added yet another layer of grief to a night already freighted with emotion. After the final note faded and the lights came up, Freddie Mercury did something that was entirely unlike him. He left, not gradually, not after lingering for the backstage rituals that typically followed a Queen show. He left almost immediately, rushing off the stage within minutes of the performance ending. This was a man who, throughout his career, had been renowned for his love of the post-show celebration, the gatherings, the conversations, the extended unwinding with crew and close friends that transformed a concert from an event into an experience. That was as much a part of his life as the performances themselves. But not at Nebworth. According to people who were there, Mercury slipped away almost before anyone registered he was gone. He flew back to London that night rather than staying on site or joining any kind of after-party. His personal assistant Peter Freestone later explained that Mercury had received a call from his doctor before the show, a call about his health, and that this had clearly weighed on him throughout the evening. The emotional and physical effort of performing for 2 hours, combined with whatever he had been told, seemed to have drained something from him that the usual post-show energy could not replenish. The band's keyboard player Spike Edney later told Rolling Stone that the helicopter departure from Nebworth was so swift that it actually caused them to miss the backstage after-party entirely. The band was whisked away almost before the crowd had finished filing out. What Mercury had said to that crowd, his actual final public words to the 120,000 people at Nebworth, was characteristically theatrical and warm. Dressed in his crown and gown for the encore, he looked out at the enormous sea of faces and said, "Thank you, you lovely people. Good night and sweet dreams." They were the words of a man who knew how to make an exit, and in retrospect, they were among the most poignant farewells in the history of popular music, delivered by someone who may have already known, somewhere inside, that there would not be another chance. Brian May, reflecting on that night years later in an interview with Guitar World, was asked whether the band knew it would be the last time. His answer was honest and haunting. Mercury had said after the show that his whole body felt wrecked with pain, words he used regularly at the end of long tours, so the band hadn't taken it any more seriously than usual. They didn't know. They didn't ask. And Freddie, as always, kept his counsel. Freddie Mercury would live for another 5 years after Nebworth. He was formally diagnosed as HIV positive in April 1987, 8 months after the concert. He kept the diagnosis private, telling only a small circle of people, his partner Jim Hutton, his assistant Peter Freestone, and a handful of others, while continuing to work. In the years that followed, Queen recorded some of their most emotionally powerful music, including the album Innuendo, the song The Show Must Go On, and the haunting These Are the Days of Our Lives, which was filmed just months before Mercury's death, and in which his physical decline is plainly visible. Mercury did make one final public appearance after Nebworth. In February 1990, the band attended the Brit Awards, where Queen received an award for outstanding contribution to British music. Mercury looked thin and tired. The audience and the cameras could see it, but he showed up, stood beside his bandmates, and let Brian May deliver most of the acceptance speech. Mercury offered only a brief, "Thank you, good night," before stepping back. They were almost exactly the same words he had spoken to the crowd at Nebworth 3.5 years earlier. Another goodbye dressed as something smaller. On November 23, 1991, Mercury released a public statement confirming what the press had been speculating about for years. He had AIDS. The following day, November 24, 1991, he died at his home in Kensington. He was 45 years old. John Deacon, who had already begun distancing himself from the public eye, gave his last interview in the mid-1990s and has been almost entirely absent from public life since. He has never performed again with Queen under any configuration, and by all accounts the loss of Mercury effectively ended whatever desire he had to continue in music. Brian May has described Deacon as carrying the weight of that period in ways that proved simply too heavy for any continued public life. Roger Taylor has spoken many times about what it felt like to process the full meaning of Nebworth only after Mercury was gone, to understand that the concert they had treated as just another enormous night of triumph was actually the last chapter of something irreplaceable. One of the most quietly remarkable facts about the Nebworth concert is how close it came to being entirely lost to history. Because no official cameras were present, the primary visual record of Freddie Mercury's final performance exists almost entirely in the form of that Dutch audience bootleg, grainy, distant, filtered through the limitations of a consumer camera pointed at a video screen. For historians and fans trying to understand what that night actually looked, felt, and sounded like up close, the footage is a frustrating approximation of something that clearly deserved to be captured in full. The contrast with the Wembley shows from the same tour is stark. Those two July 1986 concerts were professionally filmed, and the footage from the second night was released as the concert film Queen at Wembley, which gave the world a vivid, high-quality record of Queen at their absolute peak. Nebworth came just weeks later and was, by some measures, an even larger and more emotionally charged night. But the cameras weren't there. It is a reminder of something strange and uncomfortable about live performance, that the most significant moments are sometimes the ones that happen when nobody is paying the right kind of attention. Nebworth was the end of an era that no one knew was ending. The absence of documentation is somehow fitting, a reflection of the fact that history often hides its most important turning points inside ordinary-seeming evenings. What survives, beyond the bootleg footage and the photographs, are the memories of those who were there. The accounts of Brian May, Roger Taylor, Peter Freestone, Peter Hintz, and others who stood close enough to Freddie Mercury that night to sense something, even if they could not name it. And the memory of 120,000 people who went home that August evening, having witnessed something they would not fully understand until years later. Freddie Mercury, in a yellow military jacket and a crown, telling them good night and sweet dreams, and meaning it in every sense of the word. Decades on, the Knebworth concert has taken on a quality that borders on mythological. It represents the last uncompromised image of Freddie Mercury as a performer, the version of him that the world fell in love with, in full command of an audience so large it seemed to extend beyond the limits of what the human eye could process. Everything that followed, the illness, the recording sessions in private, the withdrawal from public life, was real and important and worthy of attention. But Knebworth is the moment that feels like the full statement, the final exclamation point. What makes the night truly strange, in the deepest sense of that word, is the layering of things that were simultaneously true. It was a triumph and a farewell. It was a celebration and a secret. It was a concert that 120,000 people attended, and that almost nobody properly recorded. It was the last time 4 musicians who had spent 16 years building something extraordinary stood together on a stage, and none of them quite realized it was the last time. Freddie Mercury arrived at Knebworth by helicopter, swept in like a king arriving at his court. He performed for nearly 2 hours, with everything he had. He told the crowd they were lovely. And then he got back on a helicopter and went home, and the field emptied, and the lights went out, and the greatest rock frontman who ever lived never performed again. Some endings announced themselves. Others slipped past you in the dark. The strange and enduring beauty of Knebworth is that it was both kinds of ending at once, loudly, triumphantly, heartbreakingly final, and yet invisible as a goodbye to everyone who was there to see it.